The morning I turned 67, I woke up before the sun did. That wasn't unusual for me. After 40 years of early nursing shifts, my body had forgotten how to sleep past 5. I lay there in the dark, listening to the radiator knock in the corner of the room, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that I had been meaning to have someone look at for 3 years. The apartment smelled like yesterday's coffee, and the faint lavender of the candle I'd burned the night before, alone, eating birthday cake from a plastic grocery store container with a plastic fork because I hadn't wanted to dirty a real one. My son had not called. I told myself that was fine. He was busy. He was always busy. I got up, put on my robe, fed my cat Oliver, a fat orange tabby, who had been with me for 11 years and was the most consistent relationship of my late life, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the parking lot slowly turn gray in the early light. I thought about my husband, Richard, who had been gone for 6 years now. I thought about the house we had lived in together for 22 years. The one with the maple tree in the backyard and the porch swing that creaked every time you sat in it. The house I no longer owned. That was my son's doing. His name is Derek, and he is 44 years old. And for the first 30 years of his life, I would have told you he was the best thing I ever did. Handsome, smart, full of ideas. He had his father's eyes and his father's way of making you feel like whatever he was saying was the most important thing anyone had ever said. After Richard died, Derek became my whole world. He called every Sunday. He drove 4 hours to spend holidays with me. He told me I was the strongest woman he knew. Then he came to me with the investment. It was 2 years ago, almost to the day. He drove up on a Tuesday, which should have told me something right away, because Derek never visited on Tuesdays. He sat at my kitchen table with his laptop open and his tie loosened, and he showed me a development project, a mixed-use building in a city about 90 miles from where I lived. Retail on the ground floor, condos above. His business partner had the connections. The market was perfect. The timing was ideal. All they needed was capital. He looked at me with Richard's eyes and he said, "Mom, this is the one. This is the one that changes everything." I want to be honest with you. I wasn't naive. I had spent 40 years watching people make decisions in moments of fear and hope at bedsides, in waiting rooms, in the middle of the night, when the body and the mind are too tired to argue with each other. I knew what it looked like when someone needed something from you. I knew the particular softness people put in their voice when they were about to ask for something big. But this was my son. I sold the house Richard and I had bought when Derek was 2 years old. The house where we had Christmas mornings and summer barbecues and one very bad winter when the pipes froze and we all slept in the living room by the fireplace for a week because none of us wanted to be the first one to go to bed. I sold it for $380,000, and I gave Derek $300,000 of it. I kept the rest to rent this apartment, the one with the creaking radiator and the water stain on the ceiling. For 8 months, I heard nothing but good news. The project was ahead of schedule. The investors were pleased. Derek sent me photos of the building going up. He called more than he used to, and his voice had that particular shine to it that I associated with happiness. Then the calls stopped. Then I heard from his business partner's assistant that the funding had collapsed. Then I heard from Derek himself, in a phone call that lasted less than 4 minutes, that the project had been dissolved, that he was sorry, that these things happen in real estate, that he hoped I understood. I sat on my couch after we hung up and held Oliver in my lap and did not say anything for a very long time. I understood perfectly. The months that followed were quieter than anything I had ever lived through, and I had lived through a lot of quiet. I was on a fixed income, my nursing pension, Richard's small Social Security survivor benefit. The apartment took most of it. I stopped buying the expensive coffee. I started shopping at the discount grocery on Tuesdays when the produce was marked down. I sold Richard's watch, which I had kept in my jewelry box because I couldn't bear to wear it. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself Derek would find a way to make it right. He didn't call on my birthday. I kept feeding Oliver. I kept getting up before the sun. I kept telling myself I was fine. It was a Wednesday in November when everything came apart for the second time. I was at the pharmacy picking up my blood pressure medication when my card was declined. I tried it twice. The pharmacist, a young woman who was very kind about it, who kept her voice low, told me quietly that it showed a zero balance. I stood there in the fluorescent light with my empty canvas bag and my coat that was starting to wear through at the elbows, and I felt something very cold move through my chest. I called Derek from the parking lot. He answered on the fourth ring. I could hear noise in the background, people. Music. The kind of ambient noise you get at a nice restaurant. Mom. That was all he said. Just my name. And even in that one word, I could hear the shape of the conversation to come. I told him about the card. I told him I couldn't afford my medication. I told him I needed help. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me that he had been meaning to call, that he and his wife had been discussing it, that they felt it wasn't healthy, financially, for him to continue to be my safety net, that I had resources, my pension, my Social Security, that maybe it was time for me to look at senior living options, that there were good ones, with activities. With people my age, I was 67 years old, a retired registered nurse with 4 decades of service, a woman who had raised him, buried his father, held his family together through 3 house moves and 1 miscarriage, and the kind of slow grief that doesn't make any noise. And he was suggesting a senior living facility. Derek, I said. My voice was very steady. I had learned, over 40 years, how to be very steady when what you actually felt was something enormous. I gave you $300,000. Mom, that was an investment. Investments don't always. I sold your father's house. Another pause. The restaurant noise kept going in the background. Someone laughed at something. I'm sorry, he said, finally. I really am. But we can't keep doing this. He and his wife. That was the first time he had ever made me feel like I was on one side of something and they were on the other. I drove back to the apartment. I sat at the kitchen table. Oliver jumped into my lap, and I let him stay there until my legs went numb. I looked at my bank account on my phone. After rent, after the utilities, after the minimum I needed for food, I had $15.40 until the end of the month. My medication would cost $38 without insurance coverage. I had a decision to make. I could call him back. I could apologize. Soften my voice. Tell him I understood. Ask him please. Just this once. Could he help? I had done this before in my life. With supervisors, with difficult doctors, with insurance companies. You learn, as a woman, as a nurse, as a mother, how to make yourself smaller to fit through the space someone else has left for you. But I thought about the restaurant noise in the background. I thought about the word we. I packed a bag instead. Not much a change of clothes, my toiletries, Oliver's food and his travel carrier, the folder with my important documents that I kept in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I took the $15. I took my phone. I locked the apartment behind me and sat in my car in the parking lot and tried to think about what came next. What came next was the road, because I had nowhere else to go. I drove without a particular direction for almost an hour, until the gas gauge made my decision for me. I pulled into a station at the edge of a small town I had never been to, filled the tank with $12 of the $15, and then sat in the parking lot of the gas station with $3.40 and a cat in a carrier on the back seat, and absolutely no plan. The woman appeared at my passenger window without any warning. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, with white hair cut close to her head, and the kind of face that has been outside in all seasons for a long time. She was probably 80, maybe older. She was wearing a green coat with a wooden button that had been sewn back on with the wrong color thread, and she was holding a paper bag of groceries. Your cat is making a terrible sound, she said. She said it pleasantly, as though this were a normal observation, as though we knew each other. I rolled down my window. Oliver was, in fact, making a terrible sound. He doesn't like the carrier, I said. Does he like the car? Not much. She looked at me for a moment. I don't know what she saw. I had not cried, but I must have looked like someone who was working very hard at not crying. Are you passing through or in trouble? She asked. I opened my mouth to say passing through. In trouble, I said instead. Her name was Frances. She was 81 years old, and she lived alone in a house 8 blocks away that had belonged to her parents, and then to her and her late husband, and then just to her. Her children lived in other states. She had a spare room with a quilt on the bed that her mother had made, and she had food in her refrigerator, and she had a porch where she said you could watch the sun go down over the grain elevator if you were interested in that sort of thing. She did not ask me a great number of questions. She did not ask me to explain myself, or justify myself, or present my situation in a particular way. She put her groceries in the back, next to Oliver's carrier, and she told me to drive. I stayed with Frances for 7 weeks. In those 7 weeks, she fed me soups and casseroles and something she called depression pie, which was made of crackers and brown sugar and tasted incredible. She let Oliver sleep on the quilt. She lent me her ancient laptop and helped me sort out my medication situation through a patient assistance program she already knew about because she said half the people in her town used it. She never asked me about Derek. She never asked me about the money. On the nights when I couldn't sleep, she would sometimes be awake too, and we would sit in her kitchen and drink decaf, and she would tell me about her husband, who had been a crop farmer and a quiet man, and who had loved her undemandingly for 53 years. The ones who love you quietly are the ones who mean it, she told me once. I wrote that down on a paper napkin and put it in my coat pocket. One afternoon in December, I drove to the county library to use their internet because Frances's laptop was having trouble loading certain pages. I needed to look up some information about my pension benefits, whether there were any provisions I had not claimed. I was going through the paperwork in the folder I had brought with me when I found a document I had not looked at in years. It was a letter from a financial institution, dated about 8 years earlier, shortly after Richard died. At the time, I had been drowning in the administrative weight of his death, the death certificates, the accounts, the insurance, all of it, and I had put this particular letter in the folder meaning to deal with it, and then simply never had. Life had continued. Derek had been there, helping, seeming to help, and I had trusted that everything important had been handled. The letter referenced a retirement annuity that Richard had opened in the mid-90s, before we were married, that had been quietly compounding for almost 30 years. He had never mentioned it. I think he might have forgotten it himself. It was the kind of thing Richard did saved quietly, without announcement, the same way he did everything. The account had been dormant, flagged as unclaimed property in the state system. But unclaimed didn't mean gone. I sat very still in the library for a long time. Then I made some calls. The process took almost 3 months. There were forms and verification steps, and a lawyer I found through a legal aid service who helped me for a reduced fee, because I explained my situation honestly. Frances let me use her address. Oliver continued to sleep on the quilt and occasionally knock things off her kitchen counter. The amount, after all the administrative processing, after the lawyer's fee, was $640,000. I sat in Frances's kitchen when the final number was confirmed, and I held the phone against my chest, and Frances looked at me from across the table and said, "Good news or bad news?" "I don't know yet," I said. And then I laughed for the first time in months. Really laughed, the kind that starts in the chest and doesn't have much choice about coming out. Frances smiled and put the kettle on. I will not pretend I knew immediately what to do. Money does not automatically rewrite the story of how it feels to be left in a parking lot with $3.40. It does not immediately replace the sound of restaurant noise in the background while your son tells you he cannot help you. Those things stay in the body for a while. I sat with it for several weeks, making no sudden decisions, which is something I had tried to teach my patients over the years and had not always practiced myself. The first thing I did, before anything else, was sit down with Frances at her kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen. I told her what had happened, the full number. I watched her face go through several expressions, surprise, then a certain firmness that I had come to recognize as her way of preparing to say something she meant very seriously. "Frances," I said, before she could speak, "you need a new roof." She had mentioned the roof in passing, twice. In that way, people mention things they have accepted as impossible. "Eleanor," she started, "and your car needs 4 new tires. I looked at them when I borrowed it last week. They're dangerous. I can't let you. You let me sleep in your mother's room for 7 weeks, I said. You let my cat destroy one of the quilt squares. You gave me depression pie at 2 in the morning. You are going to let me do this. She looked at me for a long time. Then she looked down at the table. The roof has been leaking in the back bedroom since 2021, she said quietly. I know, I said. I could see the stain. We argued for another 10 minutes. Then she accepted. We shook hands, formally, because that was the kind of person Frances was. And then she made us both a cup of proper tea, and we sat on her porch and watched the sun go down over the grain elevator, which was, as she had originally advertised, a perfectly good thing to watch. That was the easy part. The hard part came about 6 weeks later. When Derek called, I had been expecting it. You don't receive a large sum of money without certain people finding out, especially when paperwork and legal processes are involved. And Derek had always been attentive to things that might eventually involve money. I don't know exactly how he found out. It doesn't matter. He called on a Sunday, which was the day he used to call when things were good between us. I think he chose that day deliberately. Mom, his voice was warm. The restaurant noise was gone. I've been thinking about you so much. I should have called sooner. I should have been there for you. This year has been, I don't know. I think I wasn't in a good place. And I took it out on you. And that was wrong. I sat on Frances's porch with Oliver on my lap and listened. He talked for a while. He talked about how much he missed me. He talked about the kids his daughter had started kindergarten. Did I know his daughter had started kindergarten? He talked about how family was what mattered, how everything else was just noise, how he wanted us to start over. I listened to all of it. When he was finished, I said, I heard you found out about Richard's annuity. A brief pause. Just brief enough. Mom, that's not why I'm calling. Okay. I mean it. I've been doing a lot of reflecting and, Derek, I said gently, do you remember what you said to me in November? On the phone? Mom, you told me to look at senior living options. You told me you couldn't be my safety net. I paused. You were at a restaurant. I could hear it. He was quiet. I had $15, I said. I had my cat and $15 and nowhere to go. And you told me, these things happen with investments. Mom, I know. I know I failed you. And I'm so sorry. I believe you're sorry, I said. And I meant it. I wasn't angry, exactly. The anger had been very big for a while, and had gradually become something smaller and sadder, and more manageable. I believe you feel badly. I think you're a person who does love me, in the ways that are convenient and comfortable, and don't cost very much, and I think for most of my life I let that be enough. Because you were my son and I had decided that was what mothers did. He didn't say anything. I'm not coming back, Derek, I said. I don't mean that to be cruel. I mean it as information. I'm going to build something. A life that actually fits me, not one that fits around what you need from me. And I hope you find a way to be a better man. I genuinely do. For your daughter, if not for yourself. He tried a few more times. His voice shifted from warm to sad, to something with a harder edge underneath, that I recognized as the beginning of an argument he knew he wouldn't win. I let him finish. Then I said goodbye, and I meant goodbye, and I pressed the end call button, and sat there for a while watching the street. Oliver climbed up my chest and put his nose against my chin, which was his way of checking on me. I'm all right, I told him. The first house I looked at was too large. The second had a basement I didn't want. The third was a white craftsman bungalow on a quiet street 2 towns over from Frances, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, and a yard with an oak tree that was older than anything nearby, and a kitchen with a window over the sink that looked out at a small garden that the previous owner had kept. I stood in that kitchen and looked out that window and felt something in me go very still. I made an offer the same afternoon. I spent the following weeks doing the things I had put off for too long, not just the house paperwork, but the things you let slide when you are spending all your energy surviving. I got a complete physical, which had been overdue. I found a financial advisor through a referral, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who spent most of our first meeting making me write down everything I owned and owed, and who at the end of the meeting told me that managed correctly, What I had would take care of me for the rest of my life if I was reasonable about it. I cried a little in my car after that appointment. Not from sadness, from something that I didn't have a clean name for relief. Maybe, or something older than relief. The particular feeling of solid ground after a very long time of not being sure where to put your feet. Frances's roof was replaced in the spring. She called me when the workers finished and described the whole thing to me in detail. The sound of the old shingles coming off, the color of the new ones, the way the back bedroom had already stopped smelling like damp. She sounded younger on the phone than I had ever heard her. "You didn't need to do this," she said. "You cooked for me for 7 weeks," I said. "We're still not even." She laughed, which was worth more to me than I can adequately explain. I also set aside money for Frances's granddaughter's college fund, which Frances did not know about until the letter arrived from the Educational Trust. She called me immediately, very flustered, and told me it was too much. I told her it was not enough. We argued for 11 minutes, which was progress from the roof conversation. My house, not a rental, not someone else's space I was being allowed to occupy, came together slowly and in the way I wanted it to. I did not rush. I bought furniture I actually liked, rather than furniture that was practical and would do. I painted the bedroom a shade of blue that Richard had always liked, and that I had never chosen for any room in my adult life, because there was always a reason to choose something more neutral. I planted herbs in the kitchen garden. Oliver claimed the porch immediately, and spent his mornings watching birds with the focused intensity of an animal who knows he will never catch one, and has made his peace with this. I was not lonely, which surprised me a little. I had expected that, on the other side of all this, I might be. Instead, I found that the quiet felt different when it was chosen, rather than imposed. I joined a book club at the library 2 towns over. I started volunteering at the hospital once a week, not nursing, just visiting, sitting with people who needed someone to sit with them. I was good at that. I had always been good at that. Derek sent a card at Christmas, a store-bought one, with his whole family's name signed at the bottom, including the daughter, who was now, I calculated, 5 or 6 years old, and probably could not actually write her own name yet, but whose name was there anyway in his handwriting. I put it on the mantelpiece and looked at it for a few days, and then put it in a drawer. I did not send one back. That was not coldness. It was accuracy. One evening in late January, I was sitting on the porch with Oliver and a cup of coffee, watching the light change over the oak tree. The air was cold, but the kind of cold that is clean, not punishing. I had a book in my lap that I was not reading. I was thinking about Richard, which I did regularly and without grief. The way you think about something that was good and is finished and does not need to be mourned, because mourning is for things that were incomplete. I thought about the letter in the file folder that I had almost not found. I thought about the parking lot in November. I thought about Frances's kitchen at 2 in the morning, and the paper napkin with the sentence about quiet love, which I still had in the pocket of my coat. I thought about the particular way life has of running you all the way to the edge of yourself before it shows you what you're made of. I had been to the edge. I had stood in a parking lot with a cat and $3.40 and no plan. I had accepted a stranger's generosity without pride, which is harder than accepting it with pride. I had said goodbye to my son without rage, which is harder than saying it with rage. I was 67 years old, and I was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where I was supposed to be. Oliver stood up, stretched in the elaborate way that only cats can, and settled himself directly on the open book in my lap, which is what he did whenever he felt I had been reading long enough. "Okay," I told him. "I'm done reading." He purred. The oak tree held its ground against the January wind. The light went gold and then gray and then that particular blue that comes right before dark. The color I had always thought was the most honest color, the one that doesn't pretend to be day or night, but is just itself for a few minutes before one thing becomes another. I pulled my coat a little tighter and stayed out until it was fully dark. I was in no hurry to go inside. I had a warm house waiting, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.